And I also have a link to the source sheet. So I will put it in the chat. I will also, of course, show it on the screen, show the sources on the screen, but in case you wanna, if it's more convenient for you to open it on a different screen or whatever, or to have it afterwards, you can copy the link and you can see it even after the shiur. Also, if you wanna, flip back and forth and not be focused on the specific source that I'm showing on the screen, you're welcome to. So good evening, good morning, good afternoon, whatever time zones are here. My name is Sigalit, and feels like I've been with the Women's Study Day first as a learner and then as a teacher for quite a few years. I live in Shorashim, which is a small village up in the north of Israel in the Galilee near Carmiel, and several of the members of my community are also here. And the shiur that I want to teach today is actually, as I said before we officially started, a variation on a shiur that I co-taught with Rabbi Mark Rosenstein, who's also a resident of Shorashim. We have a custom in Shorashim where on Yom Kippur, after Kol Nidrei, where on any other holiday or Shabbat, you rush home to finish up the details to prepare dinner and then you eat. On Yom Kippur, you obviously don't have to do that. So there's some time spare, and so we usually have a shiur, which is quite well attended. Maybe it's the best attended shiur in the whole year, because what else is there to do on Yom Kippur anyway? And this year was kind of weird because Yom Kippur this year, since we were in the north, and this was in October, this was still at the time when the IDF was in ground operations within Lebanon, and Hezbollah was lobbing rockets at the north of Israel. And so we needed to be prepared to rush into a shelter during the Yom Kippur prayers. We had to move our tefillot, Kol Nidrei, from our synagogue to one of the kindergartens that had a large enough shelter quite close by. And the shiur was there in that context. And you will recall that Yom Kippur was, I don't know, about 2 weeks before Simchat Torah. And Simchat Torah would be the anniversary of October 7. And of course, it's one of the happiest Jewish holidays. And we were trying to navigate the question of how we could combine Simchat Torah with its happiness and its dancing and its singing with the situation, with the war, with the hostages, with so many fallen soldiers and murdered civilians, with so much pain in the world, with the worrying news about the anti-Semitism around the world, the Jewish community facing rhetoric and attacks. And it was kind of hard to reconcile these two directions, emotional directions, if you will. And we decided to devote the shiur, the lesson, to that, to celebrating amid the sorrow. And Simchat Torah passed, and we're facing Purim soon. So that's another kind of celebratory holiday. And also, I have to say that it's been 16 months now, and life goes on, and we do have simchas. Children keep being born, and people get married, and we still need to reconcile that. Sometimes it's within the private sphere, sometimes it's in the public sphere. And I want to also say that this is not something that is unique to our times. It's something that Jews have faced for generations before. And so, as we usually do, we turn to our sources to see what these wise people have to say about it. So I want to share a few texts. And before I start, I want to say that we're a largish group, 30 people. But I still want to encourage you, if you want to add your thoughts, your questions, your alternative interpretations, do feel free to unmute and throw in your words. Try to be concise, because in such a large group, then we want to be able to move on to the text, and we won't be able to discuss at length. But I always think that people enrich the conversation, so feel free to do that. So the first text that I want to share with you is a text from the Babylonian Talmud, and it's describing a conversation after the destruction of the Second Temple. And we don't know exactly how long after the destruction, and that's maybe one of the interesting questions to discuss afterwards, but let's read it and see what it says. And I
Sorry, can you enlarge it, please?
Yes. Okay. And again, if you wish to view it on your screen independently, and then you can scroll back and forth, then I sent the link in the chat and you can open it. And then you'll have it on your own screen, on your own window, and you can manipulate it as you need. So the Schechter taught, when the temple was destroyed a second time, there was an increase in the number of ascetics among the Jews, whose practice was to not eat meat and to not drink wine. And I think many of us, as a sort of visceral response after October 7th, kind of naturally did that, felt the need to somehow reduce our enjoyments of physical things, because really, how could you with the way things were going on? And so yes, you're right, Caroline. The daf was the daf yomi just a couple of weeks before Simchat Torah this year. And Rabbi Yoshuha, who was one of the central sages at the time, joined the ascetics. He said to them, "My children, for what reason do you not eat meat and do you not drink wine?" They said to him, "Shall we eat meat from which offerings are sacrificed upon the altar, and now the altar has ceased to exist? Shall we drink wine which is poured as a libation upon the altar, and now the altar has ceased to exist?" So now it turns out that the ascetics are withdrawing from eating meat and drinking wine, not just because they want to reduce their pleasures, but also because they feel that there's this dissonance between these pleasures and the remembrance that they raise of practices that used to take place in the temple and now can no longer take place because the temple is no longer. And meat is associated with sacrifices on the altar, and wine is associated with libations. And how can we eat and drink physically when we have all these memories clamoring in our heads? So Rabbi Yoshua said to them, "Well, if so, we will not eat bread either, since the meal offerings have ceased." There was an offering that consisted of bread, and if we're denying ourselves everything that will remind us of the temple, then we should also cease eating bread. And they answered him, "Okay, well, it's possible to subsist with produce." And he replied, "We will not eat produce either, since the offerings of the first fruits have ceased. The bikurim can no longer be brought to the temple. And so when we eat fruit, that reminds us of that." Now, offerings of the first fruits, the bikurim, are only from the 7 kinds of fruit and vegetables that are grown in the land of Israel. So they responded with, "Okay, so it's possible to subsist with other produce." You're noticing that they're slowly reducing what they can consume. And Rabbi Yoshua comes out with the ultimate response: "We will not drink water, since the water libation has ceased." And that kind of stumps them. They were silent because, well, what can you say? Obviously, you can't survive without drinking water. And he's been striking off one by one all the things with which a person can subsist. And it seems like they've reached an impasse, and now Rabbi Yoshua is offering an alternative way to respond to the destruction. He said to them, "My children, come, and I will tell you. To not mourn at all is impossible, as the decree was already issued. But to mourn excessively is also impossible, as the sages do not issue a decree upon the public unless a majority of the public is able to abide by it." So Rabbi Yeshua is drawing this continuum of mourning. On the one hand, no mourning at all. And that's impossible because how can you emotionally reconcile that with your feelings, your mourning? And you can't just continue life without regard to that mourning. And on the other side of the continuum, Rabbi Yeshua says that's mourning excessively. And the reason why one shouldn't mourn excessively is interesting. The reason he defines is that you don't issue a decree upon the public unless a majority of the public is able to abide by it. In other words, even if you have a few ascetics who are able to mourn excessively, that's not the right way to go, suggests Rabbi Yoshua. We want to mourn in a way that will enable the whole public to participate in the mourning, because it's a public disaster. And so there should be a public response. And if we define a way of mourning that is too excessive, we'll be restricting the number of people who can actually do that. And then we're at the risk of having the small group of people who will do the mourning for us, perhaps releasing all the others to continue with their lives. And Rabbi Yoshua doesn't want that. Rabbi Yoshua wants to have something where the whole people, or at least most of the people, can participate in the mourning in a meaningful way, but a way that also enables them to continue living. So here are some practical suggestions. Rather, says Rabbi Yoshua, this is what the sages said. A person may plaster his house with plaster, but he must leave a small amount unplastered. And I don't know if you still have this custom in the States, but in Israel, you can sometimes walk into a house and see that there is a small square of wall that is unplastered. And this is a remnant of exactly this custom that's defined here in the Talmud. Because you see, Rabbi Yoshua says, leave a small amount. And the Gemara asks, and how much is that small amount? Rav Yosef said, a cubit by a cubit. A cubit is, about this part of the arm. So a square like this of a cubit by a cubit. And Rav Chisda said opposite the entrance. So every time you enter a house, a Jewish house that is observing this custom, you're immediately hit by this square of unplastered wall. And you are reminded of the destruction. And I think it's not by chance that it's associated with a house, because you're mourning the destruction of the national house of God, or maybe the national house of the Jewish people, and you're remembering that within your own home. So every Jewish home has a little bit of that mourning, of the big mourning of the whole Jewish people for the destruction of the temple. But it's not just the cubit by cubit of unplastered wall. A person may prepare all he needs for a meal, and he can eat meat and he can drink wine, but leave out a small item. And the Gemara asks, what is this small item? Rav Papa said, small fried fish. So, and I think this is just an example. And probably, people can choose whatever, something that is not at the scale of meat or fruit, but something which they omit from their meals as a token sign of their remembrance of the mourning for the destruction of the temple. A woman may engage in all of her cosmetic treatments, but leave out a small matter. What is this small matter? Rav said, a place on her temple. And it's not clear if there's a special kind of ornament that women used to maybe attach to their hair that they gave up as a sign of mourning, or perhaps some way of cutting their hair. But in any case, you look at this woman and you see, oh, there's a sign there that there's mourning. As it is stated, if I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its cunning. Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, tishkach yemini. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I remember you not, if I set not Jerusalem above my highest joy. This may be a pasuk, a verse that you know, that you're familiar with, because it's the pasuk that is recited by the bridegroom in a wedding ceremony. And again, this is one of the ways in which, even at the height of happiness, we insert a twinge of sadness, a twinge of mourning for the destruction of the temple. And here's where they connect this verse to the wedding. What is the meaning of above my highest joy from the pasuk? Berosh simchati. So Rav Yitzchak says this is the burnt ashes placed on the head of bridegrooms. Bridegrooms used to have some ash placed on their heads, berosh simchati, on the head of a happy person, of a bridegroom. And again, you can imagine in the height of the wedding ceremony, the wedding happiness, you have some ash on the forehead of the bridegroom to remember the mourning. And anyone who mourns for the destruction of Jerusalem will merit and see its joy. As it is stated, rejoice with Jerusalem and be glad with her, all that love her. Rejoice for joy with her, all that mourn for her. So there's a prize at the end. If you mourn for Jerusalem, if your heart is broken for Jerusalem, then you will also see Jerusalem in its joy. And may that blessing fall upon our heads also within this morning. So I want to stop here after this long and maybe rather complicated text, and ask you if that resonates, if it resonated with you. I don't want to compare directly the destruction of the Second Temple with what we're experiencing now. Thank God the state of Israel is strong and fighting back, and is not even close to destruction. But I think in terms of shaken foundations, in terms of mourning and sorrow, then perhaps in a little way we can compare what we've experienced to the story. So I wonder if any of you experienced these feelings of the ascetics, of Rabbi Yoshua's response, of these small ways of marking the sorrow, or whether perhaps all these ways are only relevant after some time has passed, and when we're worried that we might forget, and so we're looking for a way to make ourselves remember. And I see that Caroline here is saying that 100% resonated. I quoted that section in an email to my friends group, mostly overseas, just before Simchat Torah. Rebecca, I see that you're raising your hand. So just unmute and
Okay,
dive in.
Shalom. I think that the modern equivalent of leaving something small to remind us of the sadness is wearing the yellow ribbons or other such things. In the United States, we wear blue ribbons concerning anti-Semitism. But again, we have a small item that we have on our body every day that reminds us of the sad thing while we continue in our daily lives and also try to enjoy smachot as much as we can.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, here I am with my yellow ribbon on my shirt. It's almost unthinking now in the morning to put it on. Malki, and then Debbie, and then
I also think in addition to that, the calling of the names that has become very much a practice in many different neighborhoods, and I mean, not just at where the hostages, the families of the hostages are gathering all the time, but I know I live in French Hill and we do it every Friday at 11 o'clock. Just calling out the names of the hostages.
Yes,
It's
it's a
become very
very,
meaningful.
yes, I agree. And it's a remembrance.
And also the pictures of the hostages everywhere you go.
True. Yes, thank you. Debbie?
I wanted to share that many of you who know me know that Omer Nutra, one of the Zichron Livracha, one of the Chayalim that was kidnapped into Gaza on October 7th, was a friend of mine. He was on my staff at Camp Ramah, one of the Ramah camps where I work, and every day we start the day at camp with 1,000 people dancing on this huge lawn we call the migrash. And when I got to camp last summer, without Omer there, I said to myself, I need to make there needs to be something marking the fact that Omer's not home yet. Still, we thought he was alive, but and I decided that I'm not going to dance on the migrash. I will be there. I will watch everyone else, but I'm not going to personally participate in the dancing until he's home. And it was very, very hard to do, but it feels like it was the right decision for me. So taking away some of my joy.
Were there others that joined you standing on the side, or it was kind of just you?
Not that I mean, there are people who just are embarrassed. They don't want to dance like a lunatic,
Mhm.
but there was nobody that made that conscious
Mhm.
decision.
Mhm.
Most people didn't know that that's why I was sort of standing off at the
Mhm.
side. And actually at the end of the summer, people asked me, why weren't you dancing all summer? Um,
And did the camp as a whole do any formal
oh, ab-
recognition?
absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah. We counted the days and look, it's a camp for a day camp. It's a day camp.
Mhm.
So the kids are young, but we did a lot of recognition. And then when the kids go home at 4 o'clock, we did a lot of work for Omer specifically, but also we counted the days of all the hostages, and his picture was everywhere as our other pictures.
So I want to take your this interesting description of yours, Debbie, of the private versus public gap, and read a text or two about that, because really it's something that that we see. I'm jumping to source number 3, and this is from the Shulchan Aruch, which is maybe the traditional halachic book from the 16th century. And it's talking about what happens um, when a relative of yours dies and there's a chag. And it says one who buries a dead relative on a holiday, a chag, does not have the obligations of mourning during the holiday. And I think that's something that's pretty well known. And it's often felt as something quite difficult because there's a holiday going on, but you specifically are in mourning for your mother, your husband, and if there was no holiday, then you would be sitting Shiva. But because this happened in the holiday, then you're not sitting Shiva. And this dissonance is quite difficult to hold, this celebration, this public celebration of the Simcha, whereas you yourself are in mourning, but do not express that mourning publicly. You do not sit Shiva, people don't come to help comfort you and so on. And I'm jumping here to part D here, which says, regarding that which said that one who buries a dead relative on the holiday does not observe mourning practices, this is only referring to public practices. One does observe private practices. In other words, inside your home, you are in mourning. But the public manifestations of your private mourning are subdued, are postponed until after the holiday. And perhaps this is because you don't want to ruin everybody's simcha by showing your long face. On the other hand, there's something kind of disturbing about this because you still need the comfort. And the very fact of your being, at least privately, in mourning and everybody else celebrating around you makes it perhaps even more difficult. And I'm thinking, Debbie, of you standing there on the sidelines, not dancing and watching everybody else dance and wondering perhaps that's even more difficult than if everybody didn't, if everybody had participated. But on the other hand, again, I mean, life needs to continue. And I think that call of where to delimit the private and the public is also a question that we often face in this context. And I want to say also that it's not even necessarily restricted to a time in which the public is mourning. Here's a section again from the Babylonian Talmud, from section Brachot, that is not talking about a time of sadness at all. Rav Ashi made a wedding feast for his son, and he saw the sages who were excessively joyous. So he brought a cup of white glass, and white glass at the time was very, very valuable. And he broke the cup before them, and they became sad. This is one of the reasons that people cite for this custom of breaking a glass at the end of a wedding. And of course, in our traditional weddings, when the glass is broken, the bridegroom in egalitarian weddings, also perhaps the bride, will say Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, this verse that we saw previously in the Talmud, that connects the breaking of the glass to the destruction of the temple. But in this story, that we see that at least explicitly, it's not being linked to the destruction at all. There's just perhaps this notion that we should not give ourselves over to excessive happiness, that at all times we should insert some level of sobriety, try to avoid being tipped over to excessive joy. And if we feel ourselves in danger of excessive joy, trying to recalibrate. I think that's something that in modern times is perhaps a difficult thing to wrap our heads around. Parties are parties, and nobody's trying to bring sobriety into the parties, I don't think. But it's interesting to see, and perhaps maybe it's because it's a wedding. And Rav Ashi is trying to remind us that a wedding is a very happy celebration, but there's a certain gravity there that we should be keeping in our minds. Caroline is saying that the Breslevils, who are known for their dancing and loud music in many Israeli street corners, may not agree with this measure of sobriety. Um, the next text that I want to read, perhaps I'll say a few words about it before we read it, is by the Piescene rabbi. Oh, I see that Susan here said it's all about balance, and yes, life is a balancing act, and indeed, it's about balance. So as I said, the next text is from the Piescene rabbi. This is a Hasidic rabbi who lived in the beginning of the 20th century and was caught and taken into the Warsaw Ghetto. And for several years lived in the Warsaw Ghetto, and his followers clung to him, and he gave drashot, he gave public speeches every Shabbat to his congregation about the weekly parasha, about the holidays, and trying to give them hope, trying to reconcile the terrible, terrible circumstances they were living in with some measure of belief in God, of hope, of belief in Jewish continuity. And his disciples wrote down after Shabbat the main ideas behind his drashot, behind his words, and hid them in the archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. I don't know if you know this famous story, where there was a group of Jews living in the Warsaw Ghetto who collected texts of various kinds and hid them inside milk jugs, metal milk jugs, which they buried in the ground. And this was discovered after the war by workers who were digging foundations for a building. And they recognized it as Jewish texts and moved it to the Jewish institution in Poland. And a few years later, it was recognized and sent to the Pieszczyn rabbi's brother in Israel. The rabbi himself was murdered in 1943. Before that, he lost several of his family members and really experienced all the horrors of the Holocaust. And the text that I want to read now is part of his drasha before Purim. And it's Purim of the Jewish year 5700, which is 1940. Not a very happy year in the Warsaw Ghetto, but still Purim is approaching. And here's what he has to say. It is found in the Tikkunei Zohar that Purim is like Yom Kippurim. You notice that there's this similarity of sound. Purim, Kippurim. It could be that this also hints to the following: that just like on Yom Kippur, the fast and the repentance on that day are not dependent on whether a person wants to do them, that he does them only then. Rather, whether one wants to or not, he has to do them, because they are a decree of the Holy One, blessed be He. And this is true, I think, of many of us. Yom Kippur comes around, not necessarily are we in the mood for fasting and repentance and tshuva and counting our sins and whatever. We could be in the mood for something completely different. But what the Esh Kodesh, the Admor, the Pieszczyn rabbi is saying is, what can you do? Yom Kippur comes around, and there's a decree of the Holy One, blessed be He, the Kadosh Baruch Hu. You have to fast. And so you obey the decree and you fast. And he says maybe the fact that the Tikkunei Zohar is comparing Purim to Yom Kippur is because that so too it's with the joy of Purim. It's not only if a person is joyful on his own, or at the very least is able to bring himself to joy, that he must rejoice. Rather, even if he's low and his heart is broken, his mind and all of his spirit trampled, it is a statute that he must, at the very least, bring a spark of happiness to his heart. If you think about it, this is really weird. Mele, forcing yourself to fast and to repent, but forcing yourself to be joyful? How does one do that? And can one do that? And should one do that? And I wonder what you think about that. Forcing oneself to be joyful when all the circumstances around you are pointing you towards the opposite. Imagine those Jews in the ghetto in Warsaw forcing themselves to be joyful for Purim. Why? How? Ariana, go ahead.
I connect it by similarity. If you smile at someone, it also helps bring some happiness to you and the other person. I don't know that that means you get fully to joy, but it's a start.
Yes, Nancy, go ahead.
So I'm thinking back to a few years ago when my brother died, and it was Purim, and there was the community was celebrating, and just being present with the community was a good action for me. Hearing the Megillah was a good action for me. It didn't mean that I was joyous or that I didn't have my own thoughts, but it didn't leave me the same type of sense that I would have had the community been one place and I was alone.
So people here were talking about balance, and perhaps what you're suggesting is that there's some kind of a balance that is formed between the individual mourning and the community joyful that somehow ameliorates the mourning a little bit and brings a tiny drop of joy, perhaps,
Yeah,
into the
I think even like during a Shiva, when people sit around and talk about the person who has passed away and bring stories that make the mourning family smile because they're thinking happy thoughts about this person, even though they're in mourning for the person. I think it's important to, even within the sorrow, to find the joy. And when you think of like in the Warsaw Ghetto, as bad as it was, if they didn't find moments of joy, even as a community, then what was the point of going on? I think that's the only way to have the hope and to find any kind of resilience is to not give yourself totally over to despair, but to find little sparks of joy at the personal level and at the communal level.
Yeah, again, we're talking balancing here between Jewish memory and public um, feeling and also Jewish continuity and hope for the future. I see several people want to comment, so maybe let's do Naomi, Marion, and Marcy, I think, wants to say. Okay, so Naomi.
Yeah. First of all, my father, I was also sitting Shiva during Purim, but that wasn't what actually came to my mind. What came to my mind was Simchat Torah a year after October 7th, when we had a lot of debate about how to celebrate Simchat Torah, to dance with the Torah, not to dance with the Torah, how to find that balance. And many people, including our congregation, took the stance of making a very subdued Simchat Torah. And my personal feeling was quite the opposite. I thought that we should not let them destroy our hug on top of everything else, that the resilience in celebrating, that was part of the resilience, part of the standing up and saying, no, we're not going to be crushed. So I do think that's a very a complicated balance. But I can really understand where, yes, it is important to say that even if everything is bad, we need to have a place where we can still be happy. And it doesn't mean we don't care. It just means that we need to not let it take over everything.
Yes, and I also want to say that it's an evolving balance because who knows what next year's Simchat Torah.
Yeah,
The
yeah, for
first
sure.
one was one way, and then afterwards we'll see. It's going to
Yeah,
be
I definitely. I don't know next year, and who knows what's going to happen? The whole world is very crazy. That's definitely true. But I would personally be sad to see Simchat Torah disappear just because of this tragedy. On the other hand, I certainly don't think it should be forgotten. There should have been. I know one of my friends who lives on a religious kibbutz moshav, something like that. They did the regular dancing, but before each hakafa, they read something about one of the people that they were close to or that had some connection to their particular community. So there was a balance. It wasn't all one way or all the other.
yeah.
But I do think that it's a question that speaks to me.
Yeah, no, I know that there were many ways of different communities navigating this. Thank you. Marion? But you need to unmute.
Yes. Okay. I had a few thoughts. First of all, I can relate to the whole thing because my husband died on Erev Pesach. And so we weren't allowed to sit Shiva during Chol HaMoed at all. And it was strange It just felt very weird. And the following week, we did sit Shiva, and it felt so good to be able to mourn with friends and family and like that.
Mhm.
And that was one thought. The other thought I had, another thought, was I was reminded of Viktor Frankl's book,
Yeah.
A Man's Search for Meaning,
Mm-hmm.
and how you look, you have an aim, you have a vision that's in the future, something to live for, and that helps.
Yes.
And in our Kehillah, of course, we decided to not dance and not be happy and sing happy songs for 3 of the Hakafot. And that's what we did.
Thank you. Marcy?
Yes, thank you so much. And before I make my comment, I would like to thank you again publicly, Sigalit, for joining our Torah Fund Study Day through PSW. I had no idea at the time that you were a rabbi as well, so no wonder you're so well spoken. Thank you
Thank you.
so
I'm
much
flattered.
again. So I wanted to add that I do the balance every time I get a message from my synagogue about someone passing and I know that person well. I shoot them an email immediately saying that I hope warm, loving, and happy memories surround you during this difficult time. So I want them to try to remember the good as well.
Another way of balancing, I think. Yes, thank you. Sue, did you want to say?
Well, in our congregation, do you hear me? Am
Yeah.
I unmuted now?
No, we can hear you.
Okay. We started each Hakafah with a tribute to those who were no longer with us. No one, fortunately, no one in our specific congregation was killed or taken captive, but our celebration was muted, and we all felt it was appropriate. I think each group finds their way, what's appropriate for them, and through compromise and through talking with each other. So that's what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, we've heard here a few group observances, trying to balance the happiness, the joy, and the sorrow. But we also heard a few experiences about balancing private mourning and public joy, or the reverse.
Yeah.
You know, my nephew just announced that he's getting married.
Mazal
In a couple of months. And we know that it's going to be complicated to handle a wedding celebration with all that's going on around us.
Yeah, yeah. When you just mentioned Purim coming up, for example, it's hard to feel unbridled joy, I think, for any of us at this stage.
Yes.
There's
But
always,
look what the Ish Kodesh says. He says, at the very least, bring a spark of happiness to his heart. And I think that's our challenge, to bring a spark.
yeah.
Spark can probably is within our possibility.
Mhm.
I want to continue with Kohelet. Kohelet is associated with Simchat Torah because it's read on Shabbat Chol HaMoed of Sukkot, but it also has something to say about this mix of joy and sorrow. And I want to read it in the trope for Kohelet because I want to put you into the mood to of Kohelet's melancholy. So here it is. לכל זמן ועת לכל חפץ תחת השמיים, עת ללדת ועת למות, עת לטעת ועת לעקור נטוע, עת להרוג ועת לרפוא, עת לפרוץ ועת לבנות, עת לבכות ועת לשחוק, עת ספוד ועת רקוד, עת להשליך אבנים ועת כנוס אבנים, עת לחבוק ועת לרחוק מחבק, עת לבקש ועת לאבד, עת לשמור ועת להשליך, עת לקרוע ועת לתפור, עת לחשות ועת לדבר, עת לאהוב ועת לשנוא, עת מלחמה ועת שלום.
It's the first time I ever heard it in the trope.
Oh,
I'd never heard it. People have always just read it.
I see. It's in a minor. It's in a minor key, and I always feel that it's very appropriate because it's Sukkot, and the autumn, and the leaves are starting to fall, and everything around is gray and brown in Israel, at least. And we're heading towards the winter, and tradition says that Shlomo, King Solomon, wrote it when he was old and cynical, perhaps, and facing his death. And he's reflecting upon life. And it's a very well-known song. It's called in Hebrew, Shir Ha'itim, I don't know, the Song of Seasons, perhaps. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. And it seems to suggest that there are these very neat boxes.
Yeah. If we're talking about being happy in a difficult time, there it says a time to be happy and a time not to be happy, separate. If you
there's actually there was a version of a song I think by the Birds from when I was a teenager or maybe even earlier, called Turn, 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 which was basically the text of the first few lines.
Yeah, of course.
No, it's most of it.
Exactly, yes.
Everything, turn.
Nobody, and most people didn't know it was from the Bible.
Yes.
It was Peter, Paul, and Mary that made that famous turn, turn, turn. And most Americans know this song from Peter, Paul, and Mary, and don't even realize that it's an integral part of Jewish ritual.
So, but I want to go back to what Sue was saying, which is that everything seems very compartmentalized. And if you want to be happy, then you have to close the drawer for sadness and then open the one for happiness. And there's no room for mixing and there's no room for balancing.
Well, thankfully, most of us don't keep our drawers so neat and we get things all mixed up.
That would be me.
Yes, it's rather a puzzling kind of suggestion, which is why I want to read a poem of Yehuda Amichai's. Yehuda Amichai, the very, very famous Israeli poet, who actually wrote a response to this biblical poem song. And here's Yehuda Amichai. I'll read it first in Hebrew with your permission, because I think always if you can, you should read a poem in the original, and then we'll read the English too. And the name in Hebrew is Adam B'chayav. Adam B'chayav, אין לו זמן שיהיה לו זמן לכל. ואין לו עת שתהיה לו עת לכל חפץ. קהלת לא צדק כשאמר כך. אדם צריך לשנוא ולאהוב בבת אחת. באותם עיניים לבכות, ובאותם עיניים לצחוק, באותן ידיים לזרוק אבנים, ובאותן ידיים לאסוף אותן. לעשות אהבה במלחמה, ומלחמה באהבה, ולשנוא ולסלוח, ולזכור ולשכוח, ולסדר ולבלבל ולאכול ולעכל את מה שהיסטוריה ארוכה עושה בשנים מאוד. אדם בחייו אין לו זמן. כשהוא מאבד, הוא מחפש. כשהוא מוצא, הוא שוכח. כשהוא שוכח, הוא אוהב, וכשהוא אוהב, הוא מתחיל לשכוח. ונפשו למודה, ונפשו מקצועית מאוד. רק גופו נשאר חובב תמיד. מנסה וטועה, לא לומד ומתבלבל, שיכור ועיוור בתענוגיו ובמכאוביו. מות תאנים ימות בסתיו, מצומק ומלא עצמו ומתוק. העלים מתייבשים על האדמה, והענפים הערומים כבר מצביעים אל המקום שבו זמן לכל. And now we can read the English. Just looking at the chat first to see if... other groups, yes. We're still talking about the birds. So the poem's name is A Man Doesn't Have Time in His Life, and you'll see that it's a direct response to Kohelet, to Ecclesiastes. A man doesn't have time in his life to have time for everything. He doesn't have seasons enough to have a season for every purpose. Ecclesiastes was wrong about that. A man needs to love and to hate at the same moment, to laugh and cry with the same eyes, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, to make love in war and war in love, and to hate and forgive and remember and forget, to arrange and confuse, to eat and to digest what history takes years and years to do. A man doesn't have time. When he loses, he seeks. When he finds, he forgets. When he forgets, he loves. When he loves, he begins to forget. And his soul is seasoned. His soul is very professional. Only his body remains forever an amateur. It tries and it misses, gets muddled, doesn't learn a thing, drunk and blind in its pleasures and its pains. He will die as figs die in autumn, shriveled and full of himself and sweet. The leaves growing dry on the ground, the bare branches pointing to the place where there's time for everything. Sue, if you're responding, then you're on mute, so you need to unmute. Sue Buchwald.
Mute. I thought I unmuted.
No.
That is really profound. I like it.
You want to say anything specific, or you're still under the general impression, which is?
No, this is my general impression, but I think every line is worthwhile.
I love this poem. So Anne, and then Rebecca.
What I was thinking is Kohelet is talking about a community and Amichai is talking about an individual. And I think within a community, you do have time. You have to make the time because communities are large and everybody's reacting differently. So I don't know. I'm confused by it, but you respond even if as an individual to, as you were saying, sitting shiva, when somebody smiles at you, all of a sudden you're smiling. So within a community, you can feel different things too at the same time. I don't know. As I'm talking, I'm getting more confused myself, so I'm going to stop.
That's the sign of a good poem, that it leaves
Yeah.
you puzzled
Yeah.
and wanting to read it again and again to get it more of it. But yes, I think what I'm hearing from you is the importance of trying to synchronize the community, because really people have different emotional balances and different paces and different rates, um, and then perhaps there's this danger that you're getting fragmented, and you're suggesting that there's a need to to somehow try to synchronize, if not all the drawers of the community, at least some points in time. Perhaps what the Ish Kodesh, the Peshtian Rebbe, was saying, that Yom Kippur is a time that is set for communal soul seeking, and Purim is a time that is set for communal joy. And even if personally you're not attuned to that specific feeling, then being part of a community, then that's something that you try to synchronize with. Um, yeah, thank you. Rebecca?
Well, it's interesting. Ecclesiastics is saying you do one thing or you do the other. Amachai is saying you do them both at the same time.
Yeah.
You have a different perspective on how to handle opposing emotions. Very different perspective. And some people are very good at handling love and hate at the same time. Other people need to do all love or all hate. And we were talking earlier about balance and moderation. And I think that Judaism tries to teach us not to go overboard excessively to love or to hate, or to love and hate at the same time exceedingly, but rather to balance all of this. And Amachai is asking, is this even possible until we are in the eternal world?
Yes, I want to share the poem again, because I think I agree, Rebecca. You said whether it's even possible. It says here, he says here, it tries and it misses, gets muddled, doesn't learn a thing, drunk and blind in its pleasures and its pains. And really, I think when we're trying to reach these balances, then it's really a very difficult process, and there's a lot of trial and error and misses and muddles and so on. And as communities, we're trying to handle it at a more perhaps moderate pace, to try and set at least these anchors in time in which we can synchronize all the members of the community, where we can connect with people's individual feelings, but also try to set some kind of a community-wide heartbeat, um, as it were. And I think this is even more complicated in the Jewish world, seeing as we are so geographically dispersed, seeing as how we have really different experiences. I think during the past 16 months, we've really felt that the Jewish world has come together, but still one must admit that we have really different surroundings and so on, but still there's this feeling that there needs to be a people's wide response. Malki, I see that you wanted to add.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking of, what we're living through and the mixed emotions that are happening all of the time, like the total excitement and emotional, I don't even have the word, of watching these families reunited together and the hostages coming home. And against that is the background of the hostages that are coming home not alive, but dead. And what the Bibas family is going through. I mean, it's just everything is all muddled together. And so I really think that's part of what maybe what he's saying in the poem, that, it all comes together, whether we want it to be mixed together or not. It's part of our reality.
Thank you. I think that's a very appropriate sentence to end with. Indeed, the past few days have really been so confusing so muddled, so mixed, so heartbreaking and so thrilling. And we're still struggling to find the balance as individuals and as communities and as the whole Jewish people. So thank you all for your comments and your participation around the world. It's been my pleasure. And we need to end now so people can transition to the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sigalit.
Thank you.
Sigalit. Thank you very much.
Sigalit, as always, you are
Thank you.
fabulous.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Sigalit never disappoints.
Thank you very much.
Very, very worthwhile. Okay, so now what do we do?
Click on the link for the next session, probably an email that you got.
And now I have to figure out how to close this one.
You don't have to close it. If you click the next one, then it'll ask you if you want to leave this one and go to the next.
I don't see where to do that.